TESOL Pop Season 10 Special Episode. Hello and welcome to TESOL Pop, the mini podcast for busy teachers. My name is Laura, and joining me today to talk about improving our attention span is the founder of the Learning Cosmos, André Hedlund. Now, I say our attention span because this is a challenge for us as educators as much as it is for our learners. So in this episode, André talks about the challenge screens are presenting to us, what he's seeing in classrooms, as well as solutions that he sees going forward to improve the quality of our attention and therefore our learning. So let's jump into this conversation where I asked André about the challenges we're facing right now.
For the very first time in history, we are delegating social interaction, and things that make us human, let's say, to machines, to digital devices, right? And I feel like there's a trend in education, and people are trying to make their classrooms more techy or tech savvy or digital because they feel that this is going to benefit their students. They're going to learn more. But we have data showing that IQ levels are dropping. And that's something that we should all be concerned with, even if IQ is not the best predictor of anything. It's a psychometric scale, but it is something. And this has never happened before. Since we've started measuring IQ, 80 years ago, each generation became, let's say, smarter. They were smarter than their parents. They had a higher average IQ when compared to their parents. But for the first time now, the generations coming now, they have lower IQ compared to their parents. And that has a lot to do with dealing with too much information. Maybe we should rethink how, to teach and implement those digital techs in the classroom, because the architecture of the brain remains pretty much the same. So we have to go with the brain, follow the brain. Don't go against the brain. That's what I think anyway. So I'm concerned. Yeah.
There's a lot of layers of complexity to this issue, isn't it? It's like the social interactions that we need to be having, the enrichment of our lives that brings, that the phone is kind of stealing from us, the screens are stealing from us, the IQ dropping issue, particularly applying to the younger generations, like you said, and also that dopamine searching, the hunting for that kind of quick fix that is like an addiction. I'd also add, like, the pandemic has probably exacerbated this, thinking about all that time we had to spend indoors, self-isolating for so many locations, that certainly wouldn't have helped. So that's probably also, made this issue worse. And I'm wondering, what are we now seeing then in the classroom? How is this translating to classroom practices? You mentioned earlier at the very start that teachers are seeking to bring tech into the classroom and bring in like the latest trends and stay tech savvy, but that may not be what they should be doing from what you're saying. Maybe that's not
Yes.
a good thing.
Well, I think maybe we should be doing the opposite in many regards, I think. One of the reasons why is that we need to practice or train, let's say, something that we know as executive functions, right? So our prefrontal cortex, that's the last part to mature, to develop in the brain, is responsible for the executive functions. And one of them is really about regulating your emotions, your behaviors, and stopping, your impulses, and making sure that you can control the things that you think of. So your thoughts, your everything, basically. So it's your operational control center, let's say. And the only way for you to train those skills is for you to actually be in contexts or situations where opportunities arise for you to do so. So if you are in a context where you get frustrated, and then you have to practice your inhibitory control, that's how you train it. But the thing is, more so than ever, whenever kids get frustrated, they get a tablet, they get a phone, and then they are distracted from that feeling, and they don't get the chance to practice, to train that particular executive function. And then if you think about the pandemic, that's exactly what happened. Parents were desperate because they had to work. Teachers were even more desperate because they had to make sure that kids were getting some sort of education, and they were teaching remotely, and they were trying to make sure that kids were not frustrated. And maybe that's a recipe for disaster. I'd say we need to make sure that kids are listened to, are welcome, that we establish rapport with them, but we cannot avoid frustration. Frustration is part of life, and as human beings we need to learn how to deal with that. We have to learn how to better manage our emotions, and that's what happened during the pandemic. Emotions were all over the place. We didn't practice or train the executive functions that are responsible for helping us deal with them. And now I think it's very clear now, we can see the consequences. And you mentioned dopamine, and I just wanted to add that that's the thing about dopamine. Dopamine is one of the most important, well-researched neurotransmitters in the literature. So we've known about dopamine for a couple of years now, and we know that dopamine is not really related to a rewarding feeling, not necessarily, not directly. It's much more about a reward seeking situation. So dopamine is released when we're looking or when we're searching for a reward. And a reward could be anything. It could be a smile from your teacher, a compliment, it could be a hug, it could be a golden star, it could be anything really. And when we get dopamine very easily without making any effort or without putting a lot of effort into whatever we're doing, we get addicted very easily as well. So what is happening in our students' brains nowadays is basically that. They get dopamine very quickly from their digital devices. So the notification, the score of a game, they get points, and usually there's music. Visuals are incredible, right? So special effects, all of those things are very dopaminergic. They help you release dopamine, but you don't have to put any effort, or you have to put just a little effort into doing that. So our balance, and we call that homeostasis, right? Our bodily, let's say, balance is off. We have to to make sure that whenever we get that surge of dopamine, we have to balance that out. And then suffering is involved, frustration is involved, because that releases a stress hormone, cortisol, right? Which is also very important. So what is happening is that we're trying very hard to avoid cortisol release. Kids cannot get stressed, kids cannot get impatient, kids cannot get frustrated, and we're just giving very cheap dopamine, games and everything, and then their balance is completely off, and that's very bad. We have to become better regulated human beings.
We've covered a lot in the space of this episode, and I bet listeners are thinking, oh gosh, this is a big problem. I'm noticing it. What Andre is talking about, I'm noticing in myself, in my students, maybe in my school environment. What's one thing that those listeners can do today to maybe turn things back a bit and to start creating space for, I know it's just uncomfortable, right? To have to struggle in your learning rather than just quickly getting an answer or getting those dopamine hits. What could be one thing that's very achievable that they could try out today?
Well, I think the best answer I can give you right now, Laura, is go back to basics. Think about what you had as a student. What you had to do as a student when there were no screens. There was no internet connection or anything like that, and we played a lot. I wrote for an article for MET, Modern English Teacher, about the human factor, and I think that's what really matters. Nowadays, people are talking about artificial intelligence. They're talking about augmented and virtual reality. They're talking about all types of amazing technological things that we have. But what about the human factor? Actually connecting with the human being sitting next to you and looking that human being in the eye and touching that human being, like giving them a hug, playing a game with them, and having a real conversation with them and moving around that space as an animal does, recognizing, scanning the space. That's what we have to do. We have to go back to that kind of scenario. And I'm not saying we should get rid of all digital devices or anything like that. I think there's a moment for you to use them in the classroom. But if you look at the research coming out nowadays, there's an American psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, And he wrote a very interesting book, the Anxious Generation, I think, the Anxious Generation. And he talks about how risky playfulness is very important. And it's funny because he grew up in the 70s, 80s, and he shows a picture of a playground back in the day. The playground was a place where you could actually fall and break an arm, And nowadays they are all protected, right? and yeah, sure, we're concerned with, kids and their well-being, of course. But I think because we're overly concerned, we're extremely concerned, we're doing more harm than good. We have to let kids experiment and take chances and have risky behavior, because those are very important opportunities for them to train those executive functions, to develop their cognitive potential, and to become better people. That's the idea. Yeah.
Lots of food for thought, but like you say, going back to the basics, creating space for uncertainty and not being scared of that, but maybe doing it through the means of play-based learning, and having fun with it is such a joyful way to kind of approach what does seem like a big, scary problem. Thank you today for sharing this, André. It's always such an inspiration talking to you. Before we wrap up, where can people find you to learn more and to follow your work?
Okay, well, thank you for having me again, Laura. It's always a pleasure. And if you're interested in following what I do, I'm all over social media, but you can find me now at Learning Cosmos. So make sure you Google Learning Cosmos. You will find the article, the website. I have an Instagram profile nowadays. And I also have published, a couple of books, and the main one being The Owl Factor. And I think the last episode was on that. So if you're interested in discussing a little bit of philosophy and teaching and Socrates and fables and owls, make sure you Google The Owl Factor as well, and you will come across my website and my social media.
That's brilliant. Thank you, André. And as always, listeners know that I'm going to include those links in the show notes so they can find them very easily.
If you've got a question or an idea that you'd like to pitch to the podcast, then you can go to the website tsopop.com. Finally, you can support the work we do here at TESOL by sharing the episode with your teaching community, by leaving a rating review wherever you listen to the podcast, or by even buying us a coffee by going to ko-fi.com/TESOL.